Welcome, Emily.
Hello, thanks for having me.
From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. On Sunday, an already fragile Middle East experienced a whole new shock.
We start with breaking news from Iran.
These are the images rocking the Middle East this morning. The charred remains of a helicopter, its tail partially intact.
So the authorities announced that they first found the wreckage, and they immediately said that there is no sign of life around this wreckage.
For hours, search and rescue teams struggled against dense, mountainous terrain and a pea soup fog. But on Monday morning, it was announced that the Iranian president, Ibrahim Raisi, had been killed in a helicopter crash.
In the name of God, we come from God and we return to him. It was with great sadness and regret that I received the bitter news of the martyrdom of the devoted religious scholar, the popular president.
I've just spoken to the intelligence authorities. At this point, there is no evidence of foul play. It looks like an accident.
Thousands have lined the streets of Tabriz, where President Raisi's funeral is being held. But there are many Iranians who've been celebrating the death of an unpopular, hardline president. With new presidential elections set to take place in the next 50 days, the future for Iran is suddenly far less certain.
Ibrahim Raisi was a very leading contender for the position of the supreme leader. Now, the big question in Iran is what happens when Ayatollah Khamenei passes away. A key contender for that was Ibrahim Raisi. And so with him out of the way, that would be very significant.
Could this be a moment that shakes the regime and its grip on power? The story today: a helicopter crash, a dead president, and Iran on the brink.
My name is Rana Rahimpour. I was born and raised in Iran, and I lived there for 25 years until I moved to London to work for the BBC's Persian service, which I did for 15 years. I primarily broadcasted in Persian for the people who are based in Iran and across the world, but I also covered Iran in English for the rest of the world.
Rana, take us back to Sunday. When did you first hear that something was happening? And just talk us through how the day unfolded. Where was the Iranian president when things started to go wrong?
Well, I found out about the story around Sunday afternoon. I checked my phone and I saw the story that the helicopter of the Iranian president had gone missing. Ibrahim Raisi, the Iranian president, had gone to the border of Iran and Azerbaijan to inaugurate a dam with Azerbaijan's president Ilham Aliyev. And on his way back, the helicopter had disappeared in a forest in East Azerbaijan province, which is an Iranian province, called Dizmar. Initially, we were all glued to our social media accounts and just scrolling Twitter, and there was no news. There was a lot of confusion. State media first denied this, and they said that the president was absolutely fine. But then slowly the news emerged that it seemed that he had disappeared.
از ساعاتی پیش که پیگیر خبر سانحه بالگرد رئیس جمهور هستیم در گفتگوهایی که با وزیر کشور.
There was a moment on Sunday night when I think most people realized that the helicopter had definitely crashed and there was very little chance of survival because Iranian state media actually started asking people to pray for the president. What was that like?
Yes, and that's the moment that many Iranians thought, okay, probably it's over, especially because state media started broadcasting a prayer, it's called Du'ay Tawassul, which is a prayer for help. And although the Iranian officials and state media were refusing to give any news about the whereabouts of the president or his health, many Iranians immediately concluded that it was over. But it was a very tense 24 hours until they got the confirmation that the president had been killed.
And they were showing bits of footage of people driving along, almost using their mobile phones to film what was ahead of them, trying to get to the site of the helicopter. But just describe what the conditions were like.
That's interesting because obviously there were a lot of conspiracy theories going around. But when those footage emerged and we saw how foggy the conditions were, then we thought, okay, there could be a plausible reason behind the crash. And people were very curious to know what was going on. So some people were trying to reach the crash site.
As you can see, the tail of the helicopter is here. The front part is also here. We came to this place under really difficult conditions.
But it was very difficult. This was a very mountainous area and very difficult to reach.
I mean, from the footage I saw, you literally couldn't see beyond a couple of meters. I haven't seen a fog like that for years. You described how, at the same time, there were conspiracy theories being put around. People, until they saw that fog, were convinced all sorts of things might have happened. Just describe that. What was happening on social media? What sort of speculation were you seeing?
Yes, there were conspiracy theories, and frankly, we can never really find out what happened. But initially, including myself, thought that, this must be Israel, because of everything that is happening between Iran and Israel in recent weeks and months. We thought, no, that this doesn't sound like an accident, especially because of the close ties between Azerbaijan, where President Raisi had visited before the crash, and Israel. So the conspiracy theories were twofold. One was the possibility of an Israeli sabotage/assassination. And then the second one was the possibility of an inside job, because of all the infighting amongst Iranian political factions, and assassinating political rivals is not unheard of inside Iran. And those were the two scenarios that many people suggested. I personally thought that the first scenario, Israel being involved, was the most likely scenario.
Really?
When it happened, yes. But when I saw the footage of the fog, I thought, okay, no, it's impossible to see anything. And in this condition, it's likely for the pilot to have crashed into the side of a mountain.
For some time, what looked like almost jokes on social media about this being an Israeli agent called Eli Copter behind it were even reported on French TV.
Affirme que le pilote de l'hélicoptère serait un agent du Mossad. Il donne même son nom, Eli Koptar. Est-ce que c'est vrai ou pas, bien entendu?
I know. I knew that Iranians have a great sense of humor. But what we saw in the hours between the first news and the confirmation, when it came to the sense of humor of Iranians, I had never seen anything like that. Eli Copter is just one of, I'd say, thousands and thousands of jokes that were being made. And they were hilarious, yes.
Rana, just describe that, because it's very difficult, especially if you're in Iran, to be saying these things on social media. But, we started seeing, even when there was just reports that the helicopter had gone down, people were putting up dancing emojis, people were dancing and singing, doing dances like a helicopter to show their joy. How unusual is that? What sort of risks were they taking? And from, what you've heard from your own family and friends in Iran, what were people thinking and saying?
So Iran is a very divided country. I don't want to dismiss those who were upset about the death of President Raisi. The hardline core that is a supporter of the Iranian regime are very upset. And today we see many of them on the streets of Tabriz attending the funeral of President Raisi. But he was a very unpopular man. And I would say that largely Iranians were happy about what happened, and that's why they turned it into a joke. The joke started from the possibility of him being eaten by wolves and bears, and then they were using footage of bears and saying that, oh, these poor bears that have to eat these people, to some women dancing, and some of those who were posting videos of themselves dancing or drinking champagne are the victims of the violations of human rights that President Raisi have been involved in.
That's interesting.
So there are many Iranians who are celebrating his death, and they are actually very happy about what has happened to him.
I suppose to understand that sort of a response within a country, you have to understand a bit more about the man. So just stepping back, people now are calling him the Butcher of Tehran, the hanging judge. Just give us a little history of Ibrahim Raisi so that we can understand why he was such an unpopular figure.
So Ibrahim Raisi was 63 years old, and he is the former judiciary chief of Iran. He has been known as the Butcher of Tehran for many, many years. And the reason for that was that at the age of 25, he became one of the judges who were involved in executing what is believed about 5,000 Iranian political dissidents.
5,000?
Yes, he was one of 4 judges who sat on a secret tribunal that was set up in 1988 that then came to be known as the Death Committee.
The Death Committee, and this is at the age of 25. Just for people abroad, just give us a sense of what it would mean to be a political dissident. Who were the sort of people they were killing en masse?
So the tribunal in which Ibrahim Raisi was a member of retried thousands of prisoners in the 80s who were already serving jail sentences for their political activities. Most of them were teenagers. Many of them had been arrested for just giving out leaflets about their political group. Many of them were members of the leftist opposition group called Mujahedin Khalq, or MEK. They were already in prison, and then the committee that President Raisi, back then he was a judge, was a member of, retried them and sentenced them to death. Even today, many families don't know where their loved ones have been buried, and they have been asking questions for decades now without any answers.
That's horrific. For teenagers handing out leaflets, that would be punishable by death. You can sort of see why he had a reputation being so hardline and so brutal just at the age of 25. What happened to him after that? How does he become president?
So he rose in the ranks. He held several judicial positions after that until he became the deputy head of Iran's judiciary. He wasn't very educated. There was a joke going on amongst Iranians that he only had a 6th grade degree. And this was evident in his speeches. Without an autocue, he barely made sense.
پیشنهاد جدیم به دولت امریکا آن است که
It's very difficult to translate this from Persian, He didn't seem bright at all, and he definitely didn't have any formal education. Most of his education were in religious seminaries. And this showed in his day-to-day actions and behavior. But he didn't fall short of political ambitions. So he ran for president in 2017, but he was defeated by President Rouhani, who back then won a landslide victory with over 57 or 58% of the votes. But then the Iranian supreme leader promoted him to the head of the Iranian judiciary, despite being defeated in the presidential election. Until 2021, when he ran again. And this time, the Iranian supreme leader made sure that his guardian council disqualified anybody who had a chance of defeating Ibrahim Raisi, and they basically handed him the throne.
When he becomes president, just give us an idea of how he served in the role. In particular, most people will have been aware of him and his very hardline stance during the protests around the hijab. I know you reported on that too. Just take us back to that moment, describe what it was like, and describe how he took on such a big moment in Iranian social history.
So it was September 2022 when a 22-year-old woman called Mahsa Amini was killed in the custody of the so-called morality police. An event that really shook Iran. Immediately, protesters gathered in front of the hospital where she had passed away, and Iran was engulfed in protests and anger. Days and weeks and months of protests in tens of cities and towns across the country.
A woman stands calmly in front of a water cannon until it has to reverse. And here, a police motorbike is set on fire. The woman filming shouts, "Look, we've got nothing, but we made them run away." As Mahsa's family predicted, her name has already become a symbol.
Women were angry. They came out on the streets. They were burning their headscarves. They were cutting their hair. And for the first time in the history of Iran, and not just the Islamic Republic, men joined women in their support. And those protests quickly turned into a call for a regime change. The regime, on the other hand, was very heavy-handed. They killed over 500 people, thousands of people ended up in prison, and the protests on the streets died down. But the act of protest, which is refusing to wear the headscarf, is continuing, and many people see that as a great achievement of those protests.
There has been a real crackdown on that too, though, hasn't there? Sort of a tougher enforcement on those hijab and chastity laws.
There has been a crackdown, definitely, but it hasn't really been successful. The regime has used various tactics. For example, they now take photos of the number plates of cars in which women are not wearing a headscarf. Shops and businesses are not allowed to offer any services to women who are not wearing the headscarf. Women without the headscarf may be arrested if they want to try use public transport. So they have used various tactics. And the most recent tactic, which started a few weeks ago, was deploying thousands of troops on the streets across the country to arrest women, and they are using violent methods.
Wow, so a proper, very hardline crackdown.
A very hardline crackdown. And the regime is very homogenized when it comes to their tactics of suppressing these kind of freedoms that women have finally achieved by losing many, many other Iranians.
Rana, one of the things that we don't talk about so much in the West when we're looking at Raisi's time as president is the economy. You know, we were very aware of the protests, but we very rarely talk about the state of the economy in Iran. Give us an idea of what it's like to live there right now, how bad the economy is, and how much of that he was responsible for.
So the Iranian economy has not been great for a long time, and it's partly because Iran has been under international economic sanctions for many years. But that's obviously not the only reason. Many analysts believe the main reason is the mismanagement of the economy and widespread corruption. It's almost impossible to find any Iranian politician or official who's not corrupt. You have to bribe people to get things done. And many children of the officials are pocketing a lot of money because of the high-powered jobs that their fathers or in some cases their mothers have. And the inflation is almost 50%.
Wow.
Which is it's on paper, it's easy to just talk about these percentages. Some relatives of mine have recently come to London to visit me, and they were talking about how difficult it is for people who don't have any saving. You would definitely find it very difficult to make ends meet.
For all of those reasons, for the hardline crackdown, the stopping of protests, terrible state of the economy, you can understand why so many Iranian people seem to be celebrating when the helicopter crashed. He certainly wasn't a popular figure. He also had a lot of enemies within Iran, though, and this is partly because he was being talked about as someone who might replace the Ayatollah, who might rise to the very top. Tell us about that. Was he a serious candidate?
He definitely had enemies, and his name was suggested as a potential candidate, but I'm not sure how seriously anybody took him. He did have enemies, and those enemies were not necessarily worried about him becoming supreme leader. He had enemies because so many people had been disqualified and pushed to the side because the supreme leader had this tendency of alienating anybody who's remotely disagrees with him on any point whatsoever.
So it wasn't necessarily that Raisi was the most obvious candidate for the job, but everybody else was being sidelined.
So the reason why Raisi's name was being mentioned as a possible successor was because he was groomed to become the president. Also, there's a history of the supreme leader coming from the presidency. So Ali Khamenei, the current supreme leader, used to be the president himself. So these were the reasons that people thought, okay, maybe the supreme leader is grooming him to become the president. But then the other name that has been mentioned is Mojtaba Khamenei, Khamenei's second son. Very shadowy character. Not many videos or footage have emerged of him. He's widely believed to be involved in the violent suppression of anti-government protests over the last 10, 15 years in the country. So he's a very, very scary character amongst Iranians. And he was the other name. That is also going to be very difficult because don't forget, the 1979 revolution in Iran came on the merit of getting rid of hereditary posts and dynasties. So for the supreme leader to have his own son replace him is not going to go down very well. And then this creates a vacuum. Raisi is gone, Mojtaba Khamenei, who knows whether he will be able to become the supreme leader. At the moment, the only name that is left is Mojtaba Khamenei. And earlier I told you that there were some conspiracy theories about possibility of internal rivals getting rid of Raisi. One name that has emerged in those conspiracy theories was Mojtaba Khamenei's.
Iran has just lost a president. It's in search of a new supreme leader, which could be up for grabs very, very soon. Feels like it's a real moment of disruption and unrest. We'll talk about the future of Iran in just a moment. Rana, even before the helicopter crash was confirmed, the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, took to social media, to Twitter, X as it's now known, and tweeted that the Iranian people should not worry. There will be no disruption in the country's affairs, which obviously is the sort of thing that makes everyone think there's huge disruption coming. This is a man trying to tell you not to worry about the obvious. What happens now? What sort of disruption is the country in for?
So it's interesting. On one level, there won't be a huge disruption because Iranian foreign policy is not going to change because it's all determined by the Iranian supreme leader. And the major decisions were not taken by the Iranian president. So in that sense, I don't think we will see any major changes. But it is a kind of disruption because Iran now has to hold an early election on June 28th. So according to Iranian constitution, when something happens to the president, the first vice president will become the interim president, and together with the head of judiciary and head of the parliament, they have 50 days to hold an election and to elect a new president. So now we have 50 days of a lot of political activity.
And presumably a state funeral too.
And a state funeral, which is underway and it will continue until Thursday. But more importantly is the upcoming election. So we have various factions. For example, we have the reformists. All of them were disqualified to run in 2021. And we have to see whether they will put any candidate forward and whether they will qualify, which is very unlikely that they will be qualified. Then we have the people in the middle, that President Rouhani, former President Rouhani, they're called pragmatics. He represented those people. So socially, they're not as liberal as the reformists, but politically and internationally, they were more open to cooperating with the West. And it was under President Rouhani that Iran signed the nuclear deal, JCPOA, which then President Trump withdrew from. And then we have the hardliners, but then even the hardliners are divided. So we have the former President Ahmadinejad, who was also disqualified to run in 2021. Who has become a rogue character inside the country.
Rogue in what way?
Because he stood up against the supreme leader over a disagreement during his presidency. He didn't go to work for 11 days and he fell out with the supreme leader.
President on strike, this is amazing.
Yes. And then we have the ultra-radicals and hardliners that were represented by President Raisi. But none of these factions have an obvious candidate. So there's now a lot of meetings amongst all these factions to decide who to put forward. And then what's interesting is to see who will be qualified to run as president. My feeling is that we will have another ultra-hardline president. A lot of people are hopeful that the supreme leader might have this change and would allow a reformer to run. But having covered Iranian politics for 15 years and having had lived in Iran for the first 25 years of my life, I think that's very unlikely that the supreme leader would allow any breathing space for anybody who is slightly against him.
Because, from the West, looking at the situation, with the protests that have happened over the last few years, with the response to the helicopter crash, you get a real sense that there is a big population within Iran that wants change. And given that there is so much disruption coming, the Ayatollah's time is also limited. Would it not be easier for him, less challenging, less likely to lead to even more protests, to allow something that looks like a fairer election?
Yes, it would have.
But I sense a but.
But he doesn't have that foresight. Just look at how he's now cracking down on the women, and there's no logical reason behind what he does, but he does it. And also he's worried about his succession. The biggest story of this election is the succession because of the supreme leader's age. It's very likely that he will die in the next 4 years. So the next president will be in charge when the supreme leader will probably die.
So that's why this election matters so much.
Definitely. That's why he has to make sure that someone who's fully aligned with his ideology will be the president of the Islamic Republic.
Rana, it's interesting that your first response when you heard about the helicopter was to think of Israel. Whilst Raisi had many enemies at home and nobody had seen how bad the weather was, automatically people were thinking of his enemies abroad, and Iran has obviously been involved in a regional conflict. It's also been involved in becoming part of the sort of rogue states, the axis of resistance, joining forces with Russia and China when it suits them. Give us a sense of how Raisi's death, at this moment of uncertainty, the fear of who comes next in succession, how all of this might play out in terms of Iran's stance to the rest of the world.
I don't think Iran's regional policy will change until the supreme leader is alive, and possibly after that, depending on who will succeed him. So being anti-US and anti-Israel is one of the pillars of the existence of the Islamic Republic, and you cannot take that away from the Islamic Republic. It defines the Islamic Republic. But Iran will be very distracted in the next couple of months because of the death of Ebrahim Raisi, and whether that distraction will create an opportunity for Israel to get involved in more sabotage and more attacks, it wouldn't be impossible depending on what Iran get involved with in coming weeks.
That was the brilliant Iranian journalist and broadcaster Rana Rahimpour. You can find her online on X at Rana Rahimpour. For more coverage of this story, you can find all the latest on what's happening in the run-up to the elections in Iran and the impact across the wider Middle East at thetimes.co.uk with a subscription. The producer today was Priyanka Daladia. The executive producer is Fiona Leach, and sound design and theme tune are by Maula Seto. If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything you've heard in this episode or anything you'd like us to cover in the future, then do drop us a line at thestory@thetimes.co.uk. Thanks for listening. See you again tomorrow.